Welcome to our conversations on lessons in reconciliation, truth, and justice in Africa. This is the third of our Lauder Africa Fall seminars. My name is Lindsay Farrell, and I'm a senior lecturer in anthropology and director of the Africa program at the Lauder Institute. I'm joined today by a scholar and practitioner who's going to help us think about the methodology of restorative justice and how countries in Africa and beyond have used these methods to overcome atrocities, past injustices, and conflict to rebuild or remake themselves. Quite deliberately, we're hosting this conversation from the United States as we wait for the resolution of a long-heated and polarizing election. 8 months of COVID-19 restrictions have added fuel to this conflict and mistrust. And our conversation also comes after months of focused efforts within our institutions to address the systemic roots of racial inequity that loom large after the unfortunate death of George Floyd in May. Through this series, we've been looking to Africa in this time and moment because it is a region in the world with the experience and expertise of managing uncertainty. During our conversations on health and entrepreneurship, we learned about innovations and adaptation and resilience. And I hope today we can explore how truth commissions and restorative justice initiatives facilitate societal healing. Joining me is Dr. Bani Ibawo, who is the Senator McMaster Chair in Global Human Rights and the Director of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice at McMaster University. Dr. Ibawo has built a career on studying societies at their very worst. As an on-the-ground human rights practitioner with the Danish Institute for Human Rights and the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, he's worked in South Africa, Sudan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Liberia, and Sierra Leone as they recovered from national conflicts. Dr. Ibawo has held numerous faculty positions in Africa, Europe, and North America, and is the author of Human Rights in Africa, Imperial Justice and Imperialism, and Human Rights. Dr. Ibawo currently chairs the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. I could not be more delighted to welcome him today. A quick note to our audience on formatting. We will spend the first half of our call on general commentary with our guest, and then we'll open up the conversation to your comments or questions. You can type these into the Q&A tab below and vote on questions that are the most interesting to you. So thank you. Dr. Ibawo, I would like to have you just start us off and just tell us what is restorative justice? How does it differ from retributive justice? Do they achieve different ends? And specifically, what your center at McMaster is doing to address it.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. And this is a pleasure to join your class and to share ideas about these important questions. So restorative justice is a form of justice that is centered on repairing the harm done to society by crime or human rights violation, as the case may be. It differs from the traditional retributive justice system in that the emphasis isn't so much on punishment or retribution, but on repairing a broken relationship. So the premise of restorative justice is that either crime or, in the case of my work, gross human rights violations are essentially processes that break up relationships, either individual relationships, societal relationships, or in some cases, national relationships. So the emphasis in restorative justice processes is to repair that harm, to repair the individuals involved, victims and perpetrator, to heal societies, and in some cases to reconcile conflicting parties. That is how restorative justice differs from a traditional justice system.
And what is your center doing?
Yes, my center. So I head the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. So I work in the intersection of human rights and peace studies. So I chair the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. And so the center is dedicated mainly to addressing human rights issues, mainly at an international level, but it's also very interested in restorative justice as a process for dealing with these international conflicts. Think think about the end of the Second World War and the kinds of justice systems that were put in place to deal with that conflict, they were mainly retributive justice process, whether it's the Tokyo War Tribunal or the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. So those have been the traditional ways in which international conflicts are resolved. But now my center is really interested in ways that truth commissions and reconciliatory approaches can be used to address human rights violations, both within nations and between nations.
Great. So when we talked before, and when I started to kind of conceive of having this conversation with you, when you think of truth commissions, you often think of African countries. I'm sure there's been others, and of course my orbit is Africa, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why it seems to be that Africa takes this pathway, or African countries seem to take this pathway in this experiment in restorative justice, like Liberia, South Africa, Rwanda have all experimented with these particular approaches.
Yeah, so truth commissions have become particularly popular in Africa. There have been at the last count, about 50 truth commissions around the world, and easily 2/3 of those have been in Africa. The early ones started in Latin America. There were quite a few there in Argentina, in Chile. But I think in Africa, the South African Truth Commission really became the benchmark for truth commissions, and since then it's proliferated across Africa. So I can think of two clear reasons why the truth commission paradigm has become particularly attractive to African countries. The first is just capacity issues. Justice, judicial systems in the aftermath of either conflict or authoritarian human rights violations can be expensive processes. Sometimes it might involve long judicial trials. The investigatory processes can be expensive. You think about the unification of West and East Germany, or the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and all those transitions in Eastern Europe were incredibly expensive processes with judicial systems and investigations and commissions of inquiry running into years. Many African countries, particularly those just coming out of conflicts, do not have those institutions, do not have the institutional capacity to use the traditional retributive justice system model. And so truth commissions, which are more participatory approaches, which are quasi-judicial approaches, which are more flexible approaches to justice, seems just more attractive. I give the classic example of Rwanda. After the genocide, Rwanda just didn't have the capacity to, persecute all those involved in the genocide, and so it adopted various methods such as the Kacha Courts and indigenous ways of resolving conflicts to deal with the society in the aftermath of the conflict. So there we have it. One is the capacity issue. The other is because there is a sense that restorative justice aligns better with some of the traditional worldviews of the society. So in South Africa, for instance, the Truth Commission was justified along the lines of the philosophy of Ubuntu, the South African philosophy of our collective humanity, the notion that if I dehumanize you, I ultimately dehumanize myself. And that kind of worldview has lent itself more to reconciliation and restorative justice rather than retributive justice. To be sure, there are debates as to whether this was just an invention by the elite to justify the TRC, but for the most part, TRCs have been sold in the sense that they align more with traditional worldviews in Africa.
So more collective, more about sort of the community justice as opposed to individual legal approaches. Do we not see truth commissions in other places, or is borrowing? Is it spread out of places that have that more collective or cooperative approach?
No, I think it's changing. It might have started off that way in more communal-oriented societies, but Canada just had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with historical injustices against Indigenous people. The Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, are in the process of developing a Truth Commission to deal with historical injustices against the Indigenous Sami people and minority Icelanders and all minority communities that have been traditionally excluded from Nordic societies. Australia, New Zealand, countries with large populations of Indigenous people are thinking of Truth Commission. So increasingly, the Truth Commission model is beginning to find attraction, not so much as a replacement to the traditional retributive justice model, but as a complementary way of dealing with it. And most recently, even the United States, there is a bill on the floor of the United States Congress for a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the United States. How far that will go remains to be seen, but at least some people are thinking about this in the context of racial justice, the legacies of slavery in the United States.
And presumably our Indigenous population as well, or is it just mostly focused on people of African descent?
Yeah, it's like the proposal that I'm familiar with focuses on slavery and racial justice, but I can assume that there might be other proposals to deal with Indigenous issues. So truth commissions come in all shapes and sizes, so it wouldn't surprise me if there are multiple initiatives to have truth commissions to address lingering historical injustices in the United States.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and we're in a very particular time of history that, I mean, we're all sort of recognizing this is a historical moment. What is the impetus under which a country, a population, politicians, leaders decide to go through a process of healing? I think what's happening currently in the United States is that people are having these conversations about how do we reach across the aisle? How do we deal with our polarization? How do we manage what seems like a kind of a really broken society? And you were talking about healing of societies, and you see the healing of relationships at the beginning of this. Do you have, okay, so let's bring it back to Africa. Do you have examples of, like, what's the impetus? What's the point at which this decision gets made that you bring a truth commission together? Is it only that a moment like this one that we're feeling in the United States, or what has been your experience?
Yeah, so, a wound has to be healed. If the wound isn't healed, I like to use the analogy of the human body and, biology. If you have a wound, it has to heal. If it doesn't heal, it festers. If it festers, it ultimately disintegrates the body politic. And that is true of societies, that wounds deep in the histories of the societies erupts every once in a while if they're not fundamentally addressed. If they are swept over, there might be temporary stability, but in almost every generation, it erupts. And so the impetus for, at least in Africa, to deal with these issues, in most cases comes out of deep-seated historical injustices. So in South Africa, for instance, it came out of a long history of colonialism and a long history of apartheid, white minority rule against the majority Black population. So when the government of Nelson Mandela came into power in 1994, one of the challenges it faced was, how do we heal society in a way that allows us to move forward as a society? It wasn't enough to just throw the perpetrators of apartheid era crimes into jail. Nelson Mandela and the ANC wanted a different model that will allow for justice, allow for accountability, but also allow for collective healing of the country. And the Truth Reconciliation model was what they opted for, and they appointed an Anglican Archbishop, Desmond Tutu, to head that commission. And they held hearings all over the country. And, there's a debate as to how successful it was. But one of the points that most scholars agree with was that at that pivotal moment when South Africa could have fractured or degenerated into conflict, the Truth Commission was useful in helping the society transition relatively smoothly to democracy. And you find all of that across Africa. Societies coming out of conflict, as in Liberia, as in Rwanda, as in Sierra Leone, all opting for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to find out what is the roots of the conflict. How can we order society in a way that allows us to coexist peacefully moving forward? But it's not always conflict. Truth commissions have also been established in the aftermath of dictatorships, authoritarian governments. Once they're kicked out, the new regime tries to turn a new leaf. We see this a lot in Latin America, in Chile, with the ousting of the Pinochet regime, an attempt at a Truth Commission to create a new body politic for society. Same thing in countries like Kenya, Morocco, Tunisia. Truth commissions have been established as a way of transitioning to a more inclusive and democratic society.
Usually after an election or an ousting.
Yes. Which also raises an interesting question. The skeptics will say, well, truth commissions sometimes are just instruments by new governments to legitimize their power and their rules. See, we are not those bad guys who, committed all those atrocities. We are the good guys, I call this the Mandela complex. Everyone wants to be the Mandela of a transition. So what do? You establish a truth commission. So there's definitely, I don't want to oversell truth commissions here. There's definitely a skeptical school of thought that says that, yes, truth commissions have the potential of healing society, moving society forward, but we should also be careful as to how politicians deploy the rhetoric of truth and reconciliation to legitimize their rule and not so much to foster justice.
Yeah, we talked about, I was in Kenya.
Yeah, so you know about the Kenyan Truth
for the
Commission.
2008 situation and in the aftermath of their attempts at building a reconciliation commission. That I think most people would just agree didn't really go anywhere.
Yeah, and that is true of many countries because intentions is one thing, the impact is different. So every Truth Commission has to be evaluated. So one of the things we're doing in my center is really do a broad comparative study of Truth Commissions across, I think at the last count, 20 countries, to see what worked, what didn't work, what were the unique elements within the country that allowed for the successes or failure of Truth Commission processes so that we can have some kind of best practice approach to how we think about Truth Commissions, because Truth Commissions have been established almost every year by countries seeking to use it as a way of bringing about peace and justice within those countries.
It would seem to me, so the South Africa example, I'd like to go back to it. It doesn't seem healed, right? The place where we continue to see violence against outsiders, violence within the country against, for racial or ethnic or, against Zimbabweans or Nigerians or people from other places. It has a high unemployment rate. It's one of the most unequal societies in the world, according to the standards of the Gini coefficient. What do you think maybe should have been done to continue the work of a Truth Commission? Was it ended too quickly? Were there more things that they should have adopted in order to continue? It's clear that more work needed to be done. That society can't just heal itself overnight.
So good point. The assessment of the Truth Commissions for South Africa has definitely changed. So today, a lot of people, if you ask them, I think I saw a recent survey and they're asking a lot of people about the Truth Commission, and a higher percentage today say it was a failure than, immediately after the hearings. Of course, you have to factor in that there is a new born-free generation in South Africa who did not directly experience apartheid and have a higher aspiration for what they want South Africa to be. So that might be a factor. But I would say that in evaluating the South African Truth Commission, one of the things to consider is what was the original goal. The first goal was to find out the truth about apartheid. What exactly happened? You have to understand the context. The apartheid secret service, the apartheid security forces operated with so much impunity and secrecy that a lot of people disappeared, as in Latin America, and nobody knew what happened to them. What happened? So in the aftermath of the return to democracy, there were a lot of mothers saying, we want to know what happened to our husbands. We wanted to know what happened to our kids. So the first mandate was truth seeking, finding the truth. The second mandate was victim-centered justice. So once we found the truth about what happened, let's bring justice to the victims. And that can take the form of persecution. It could take the form of compensation, and in some cases, amnesty. And then the final goal was reconciliation. Let's try to heal society. Let's try to heal victims and perpetrators. Let's move forward. I would argue that in the last two objectives, the objective of victim-centered justice and the objective of reconciliation, the Truth Commission fell dismally short. It didn't bring justice in the sense that it really didn't provide for adequate compensation for those who had suffered. There were recommendations for compensation. There was even a recommendation for a tax. They went nowhere. So a lot of the victims who appeared before the Truth Commission felt that they got the short end of the stick. Perpetrators got amnesty, the government got legitimacy. I mean, what about us, those of us who suffered through apartheid, they would say. On the third goal of reconciliation, I would say it's a mixed bag. South Africa is definitely not reconciled. But what about the very first goal of truth seeking? I think one of the things scholars and policymakers who assess the Truth Commissions fail to appreciate is the much work that was done by the Truth Commission in just revealing the truth, letting people know what happened. And we can't underestimate that. Knowing the truth about what happened, it's important. In the United States, for instance, there's ongoing debates about what the Confederacy flag means. Is it heritage? Is it hate? So, having these open conversations about what actually happened and what it means, it's an important part of the healing process. South Africa might not be healed today, but you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone in South Africa saying, oh, apartheid wasn't so bad and it had benefits and all that, because we all saw it on our TV sets. We saw the confessions. We know to some extent the extent of brutality and atrocities. And so for me, it's a more mixed bag. As a historian, as a legal historian, someone who's interested in the legal history of the process. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has also informed constitutional and human rights development in South Africa. So the legacy of the Truth Commission has shaped a human rights agenda within the country. So these intangible benefits of the Truth Commission are often not factored in when people make blunt assessments about the failure of the Truth Commission. I think the legacy of the Truth Commission, it's a lot more mixed than we hear from people.
It's not a linear, do this, it will get to this, and the outcome is peace and a peaceful society. It may be peace, it may be freedom, it may be openness, it may be...
It may be just knowledge.
It may even be that the born-free generation doesn't even feel it, right? Yes. That they have other sort of legacies of apartheid or legacies of inequality, but some of the original sins of South Africa, the born-free generation doesn't know.
Yeah.
So the intangible.
And they have a right to aspire for something better. So I mean, I think they have a legitimate idea. Yes, apartheid ended, but that shouldn't be the end all for us. We want a better life. And so I think it's a very legitimate aspiration for the bond-free generation to say, yes, we want to go beyond TRCs. We want a better country. We want better ways of living.
I have some more questions, but we have a question from Steve Samet, and I thought I'd ask that. He is asking, are there trends in the composition of these commissions, specifically the representation of those affected, as well as neutral observers from outside the country? He's thinking in terms of the credibility as well as the proposal of actionable remedies. I think that, you know, I was actually having this conversation with my mother. We don't have a archbishop, or we don't have a Desmond Tutu in the United States right now, right, to lead us through this. The credibility aspect of these commissions seems really...
So that question seems to have come from a legal scholar. Actionable remedies gives him away or gives her away. So legal scholars want what's actionable. What can we do with this? So, well, truth commissions come in all shapes and sizes. In fact, scholars of truth commissions have argued that, you know, what we generally call truth commissions is really just a broad name for various ways the society tries to use quasi-judicial mechanisms to deal with justice. And each country emphasizes different things. So I'll give you an example. Tunisia, for instance, called their truth commission the Truth and Dignity Commission. The emphasis was on dignity. We'll find the truth, and then we'll talk about how we can restore the dignity of our people, particularly those who suffered through the atrocities leading up to the Tunisian Revolution. The Kenyans called theirs the Truth and Justice Commission. The emphasis was on justice because of the perception that a lot of injustice was done. Notice in these two truth commissions, there's no mention of the R word, reconciliation, and that was deliberate. In many truth commissions around the world, in fact, in most truth commissions, there's no reference for reconciliation. I mean, the whole reconciliation agenda is one that was unique to South Africa and a few other truth commissions. So to answer that question, there isn't a standard. Most commissions have an outside participant, usually someone who's worked in a different country in the context of truth commission. But truth commissions are designed to be fluid, less formalistic. I mean, to take the case of South Africa, for instance, rather than appoint a retired judge or someone with some legal knowledge, you know, Mandela appoints an Anglican archbishop who knows nothing of the law and would, you know, occasionally break down and cry, you know, in the middle of hearings. And that was very deliberate. That was very deliberate because South Africa, after the end of apartheid, South Africans were very suspicious of the law. The law had been used under apartheid to victimize the majority Black population, and appointing a judge from the apartheid system would have undermined the commission from the very beginning. So it was important to appoint someone who had moral legitimacy in the eyes of the people. The Truth Commission held its hearings not in courtrooms, but in school gymnasiums, in town halls. It was about bringing justice to the people. The procedures were fluid, informal, and the recommendations were such that attended to the hearings and what they heard from the people. So yes, there's no one size fits all, but we now have enough information about what works with truth commissions that countries establishing new truth commissions have a rich pool of resources and ideas to draw from. So Gambia recently appointed a chairman for their Truth Commission, and they're working with our center to draw up the mandates of that Truth Commission. And there's a lot that they can learn from what other countries have done in going about their truth and reconciliation process.
I don't think about Gambia very much. There's quite a few, I think, sort of, I was reading something the other day and saw Cote d'Ivoire had a truth commission, I guess, in the last 8 years or something to deal with the conflict that happened there, which now with this most recent election is, you know, possibly not as effective. Can you speak to some of the, I guess Nigeria's had one. Maybe can you speak to what you think are some of the trends and why, other than they're being used by politicians?
Yeah.
Are they not ready? Do they not have buy-in? Is there not a will of the people? What are some challenges here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You could pose it in the form of why do so many truth commissions fail or fail to meet their aspirations?
Yeah.
So I think we've already talked about the legitimacy issue, that truth commissions sometimes are cynically used by political leaders as another box to check. You come to power, you kick out the old dictatorship, and you stamp your feet of authority by establishing a truth commission. So there's a cynical use of truth commissions. But more than that, I think there hasn't been enough reflection on when it is appropriate to have a truth commission. I think personally from my study that some of the truth commissions established in Africa, particularly in the immediate aftermath of war, a good example is in Liberia, we're kind of stampeded through. The international community haven't ended the conflict. There was a lot of push to get the truth commission going. And looking back, I would say that perhaps that was not the right time. Truth commissions have to come up organically, and they have to come up when society is ready. I think the Truth Commission of Liberia, for instance, came in at a time that was a bit too hasty. It didn't have enough buy-in, enough consultation, and so it remained distant from the people and was not as effective. And that is why Truth Commission process have to be thought out processes. Rather than projects, you see, they should be processes. And some take longer than others. South Korea has had 2 truth commissions now over long processes, and there's the whole politics of it. It's not, unique to Africa. Their truth commissions too has also been embroiled in ideological politics. So it's my answer would be because truth commissions have not been suited well enough to the unique peculiarities of those societies. They've not had the kind of buy-in that makes them successful. But we do have truth commissions that have been more successful than others.
Speaking of the Liberia one, who is, or even just others, are some of these being sort of imposed from external forces? In my class and conversations that I often have, we have a conversation like every couple weeks about the boogeymen or the forces of the World Bank or the forces of, Western Europe or the United States that have forced African nations to do various things, sometimes in the promotion of democracy or in the notion of trying to create stable places where maybe some money can be made. I don't know. Is this something that also tends to be like, who's funding these truth commissions? Like, who funded the one in Liberia?
Very good question, and it's interesting that you mentioned Liberia. So truth commissions, I wouldn't say imposed, but they are definitely pushed by an internationalist agenda. So when the conflict in Liberia ended, for instance, it's ended with international intervention, first regional intervention and ultimately international intervention with United Nations peacekeepers and United Nations agencies actively involved in ending that conflict. It is an open secret that these international actors were very eager to have a South African style truth commission in Liberia. They saw that as well. This is one way to do it. And they pushed it. I wouldn't say imposed. They pushed it in the sense that it was funded, not just by these organizations, but by NGOs. I mean, it might have been out of good intentions. But looking back, that was the wrong thing to do because as we speak, Liberia is one of the only countries in the world whose truth commissions record do not reside in the country. They actually reside in the basement of an American university. because they had to be taken out of the country because they were at risk of being destroyed in the country. You know, the Truth Commission had indicted some of the key personalities in politics who were not interested in it. And, you know, the chairperson of the Truth Commission did in fact feel that the records would be destroyed because there was so much hostility against the Truth Commission, and the documents were sent off to some university in the state. So when we're doing our research, one of the ironies of it all is that all these very interesting, important record of the conflict in Liberia are not accessible to the Liberian people. They are instead sitting somewhere idly in the basement of a United States university. And that for me is a metaphor for what happens when Truth Commission processes are not organic, when they are pushed, when they are rushed. They do not have buy-in. And in the Liberian case, there are many complicating factors. But the result is that there's this process that took so much effort, so much buying, so much investment, but has absolutely no relevance to the people today.
Mm-hmm. So are there other forms that we can use? So I'm thinking specifically, conflict is there. Right now, the last month, we've seen protests in Nigeria. We've seen whatever's happening in Tigray and Ethiopia. Yesterday, I was watching protests on the streets of Kampala over the arrest of Bobby Wine. Cote d'Ivoire is having its own little crisis. When does restorative justice kick in? Do we wait for the conflict to end? Is there other options to sort of push forward some of the principles of truth seeking and healing and relationship building?
Yeah, so I think about restorative justice as manifesting truth commissions as not an end-all solution. It's not the only solution. I think of it more as one more tool at the disposal of fragile states, because let's think about it. This really, it's about state fragility. I've been in a discussion in Africa sometimes, misses the big picture. So much of what Africa has to deal with, whether you're talking about the case in Cote d'Ivoire, or you're talking about the case Bobby Wine in Uganda, or in Nigeria, has to do with the fragility of the post-colonial state. That the post-colonial state in Africa is so weak and hasn't developed the robust institution to weather the shocks in democracy. I'll give you an example. Think about what the United States is going through right now. The inconclusiveness of the election, perceived inconclusiveness, the dysfunction and the risk to the transition, but things are holding on because the institutions are strong. Now imagine that scenario in an African state where the sitting president loses an election, refuses to concede. The very first thing you would find was that the military will be fractured. There'll be people within the military who say, well, we're going to support the president and others. And that's the beginning of conflict. But in the United States, because you've had 200 years to develop a military, you've had 200 years or more to develop a judicial system. Those systems are resilient enough to weather the occasional shocks that inevitably come with politics and democracy. Here in Canada, we've had a section of the country that has wanted to separate from Canada for many years, Quebec. And every year they hold a referendum. They want to leave. They lose a referendum, well, they stay for a while, and then they ask for another referendum. And the country is able to weather the shock of separatism because it has institutions. It's developed these institutions over 300 years. In an African state, fragile, that would be a recipe for conflict. So I urge my students and those who look at this conflict in Africa to think not about this conflict as unique or peculiar to Africa, but to think of them as shocks that inevitably come with democracy and state building. It's just that in the fragile African post-colonial state, the systems have not developed well enough or have not been designed well enough to weather the shocks that come every once in a while to democratic order. And that is what you see. And for me, the way I think about restorative justice, it's one more tool that African states can draw on to try and address these shocks when they inevitably come and disrupt the democratic process.
I don't know anyone out there who's listening. If you have any questions, now would be the time to ask. I have another question. So as I was telling you, we have our student body, mostly students who attend Wharton. And we often examine business risk, right? We look at like the World Bank's ease of doing business. There's something out of Michigan where you can look at business risk for different countries. And these are indices that often are aligned with political volatility or democratic freedom as their key indicators. I wonder if you could make a business case for why truth and reconciliation or restorative justice processes can help to boost risk in terms of Africa's economic development.
Yeah, so like I say, we all know from the disruption of COVID and the protests for racial justice that no one sector of society is immune from the other. I've been talking, my university here has a very big medical school and all the resources go to that medical school. And I've been trying to get the administrators and professors in that school to be more involved in issues of human rights and humanitarianism. And I think COVID has really brought home to them the interconnectedness. And I think the same is true of business, that you have to think about how it intersects with politics, how it intersects with society, with culture, and all of that. So restorative justice, one of, like I said before, many African states, one of the challenges that they do have is that they haven't built enough institutions to weather the shocks to the political system. What restorative justice does, I think, is that it provides a way to create some kind of stability, even if not at the national level, that can be business friendly. It provides a framework for conversations about business that allows for business environment. And I'll give you an example. In the Nigerian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for instance, one of the big issues that appeared before that commission was the role of oil companies in the Niger Delta. These are long-standing issues that some have gone to courts in the United States, gone to arbitration. It's even affected investments in the oil sector. And one of the things that struck me during that hearing was how again and again, those who appeared before the commission talked about the violation they had suffered from the oil companies, the pollution, how the oil companies hadn't really met their needs. And I kept on wondering, what if the oil companies had been involved in these negotiations and these conversations at a local level? And this is important because truth and reconciliation, it's not exclusive to a national intervention. I mean, there are grassroots truth commissions where communities come together and say, let's talk about this harm being done to a society and redress it. So a good example is the Greensboro Truth Commission in North Carolina, where a group of community people came together to have a commission to investigate a civil rights era human rights violation against the Black community there. That had no buy-in from the government. It was community to community. It was grassroots conversation. And so the truth and reconciliation model might be useful for business in the sense that it provides an opportunity to converse with local people in ways that might engage the government, in ways that might engage politics, but also possibly in ways that have nothing to do with politics. And if you can, the more opportunities to have that you have for these kinds of conversation at local levels, the better I think it is for business, because one of the challenges of development in Africa is this disengagement between the state and the people. And if business can't find a way to mediate that tension or that gap, then it's good for business. And we've seen many business, socially conscious, ethical investment and all of that having, an impact on relationships with local communities where they work.
Yeah, there's and that's growing, a continued growing movement. Yeah, we actually were just talking about cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire in my class.
Yeah.
And the continued struggle to stem the deforestation that has come because of it. And the big chocolate company is really actually wanting to figure it out, but not having necessarily all the mechanisms for engagement at the local level.
Yeah, and truth and reconciliation could be one of those tools. That's my point. Could be one of those tools to, engage with local communities and say, yes, we know our company hasn't been alive to its responsibilities in the past, but we want an open conversation on how to make things better. There's at the United Nations, there's this big debate now about business and human rights. And the obligations of corporations to promote human rights in the countries they work. And so much of this conversation has been, we can no longer put the human rights obligation solely on states, particularly in a world where companies are richer, bigger, more influential than states. So human rights obligations can be as state-centric as they were in the 1940s. Human rights obligations and duties also have to involve powerful corporations, and they should be accountable under international law for human rights violations.
Interesting. So I've kind of saved the I don't know if it's the best, but I've saved the most complicated for last. I'd like to talk about Rwanda.
Yeah.
So Rwanda has, such an enigmatic place. It's number 4, or no, it's like the second best place to do business in Africa after Mauritius. A tiny little country that has seen a lot of issues, and it has reconciled in some respects, and yet it scores very poorly on freedom indices. I'm not sure a lot of people think it's all that democratic. And I wonder if you can speak a bit to the uniqueness of their restorative justice process.
Yeah. So it's the Rwanda is the latest manifestation of a long-running debate in African studies about development options. At independence in the 1950s and 60s, the major development options for many African states was either you look west or you look east. You were either capitalist oriented, like Ivory Coast under Houphouët-Boigny, or you were socialist oriented. In the era of the Cold War, the bipolar world, those were the options. There was all talk about African socialism, Nyerere, and all these ideas, but the line was drawn way down the middle. In the post-Cold War era, the developmental models open to African leaders and African states are a lot more diverse. There is, of course, the continued appeal of Western-style liberal democracy, but there are also, what they call smart authoritarian governments, whether you're talking about an emerging China or the one that I see many more African countries look at these days, Singapore, or Indonesia under Suharto. To put it crudely, the sense that given that African states are still fragile, still weak, still, constrained by the horrible legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism. What Africa really needs at this point is not some kind of a Western style, laissez-faire, liberal democratic model, but some form of a benevolent dictatorship that would herald the country to a point where it can afford the luxury of liberal democracy. Singapore is always brought up as an example of that space that just works. It might not have all the trappings of Western liberal democracy, but it is good for business. It is functional. It works. And that has been the model that Rwanda seems to have opted for. So Kagame has done a wonderful work in this since after the genocide. To provide those structures in place, the political, the economic, and the social structures are advancing. And so there are those within African studies who will say, given the history of the continent, this is where we should be, and these are the attractions of the model. And they acknowledge that there is a price to pay, and the price is liberty. And they will tell you those prices are worth paying. But as a human rights scholar, I am skeptical because I have seen these before. In the immediate post-colonial era, you had those who made exactly the same argument. People like Nkrumah of Ghana, idealistic nation builders who wanted to prioritize economic development.
In Tanzania.
But we all know how that happened. It's a slippery slope. It slides very easily into authoritarian rule and into dictatorship. And then the problem happens all over again. The society becomes conflicted. So while Rwanda holds a lot of appeal to business people, to investors, to those who subscribe to the benevolent dictatorship thesis, I worry that it might be the beginning of something more problematic for the state. I would opt rather for a system that strives to balance both, that allows for some level of political freedom. Human rights are indivisible. People might get all the economic benefits they want, but at some point they will begin to demand, political inclusion, political representation. And that can be problematic if you haven't prepared the state to deal with those demands when they come, because they will inevitably come, unless you're going to repress the population forever, which is not feasible. So that will be my take, that Rwanda provides a model, and I can tell you there are many people across Africa, even policymakers, who see it as a model. But I caution when I have the opportunity to have these conversations to say it doesn't have to be one or the other. We now have the options of multiple developmental models to choose from, and Africa is best served by drawing on models that address both the economic and social challenges as well as the political and civil challenges.
And they didn't have a truth commission. They had
no, they didn't have, but they had they drew on a traditional system of justice called the Kacha Courts to deal with justice after the Rwandan genocide.
What I read and what I hear about and what people tell me and what I've experienced, sometimes it doesn't feel like it was truth that was emerging from these so much as it was a reification of a new narrative.
Yeah. So that goes back to the point I was making. So when after the genocide, the government of Paul Kagame was laser focused on nation building. We're going to rebuild a nation. We're going to assert unity. We're going to leave behind the divisions and factionalism of the past. We're all going to be on one page. Well, that is good if you're thinking of, nation building in the sense that we all agree, but it creates its own challenge. So what that does is that it allowed the government, and particularly Kagame as leader, to take some very bold developmental initiatives, which has paid off. You go to Kigali today, you cannot but be impressed with what that country has done just a few decades after a genocide, a horrible genocide. But what it also did is, and I hear this particularly from victims, is that it does not allow enough space for dissent. I mean, just think about something as simple as how the genocide itself is commemorated, that the government wants a particular narrative of what happened during the genocide. You didn't have Hutus killing Tutsis. You had perpetrators killing victims. We don't want to name who killed who because we want the nation to move forward. It's all well and good from, if you're thinking about it from the level of the state, if you're thinking about it from the level of state legitimacy and state building. But if you're a victim, who knows exactly what happened to you and wants the story told as you experience it, it becomes very problematic because you get the sense that your experience is not given space to thrive. I mean, is that a price to pay for national unity? Depends on who you ask. But what I see in Rwanda is a prioritization of economic development over some of the political and civil liberties that some within the countries feel they should have.
Okay, so final question.
Yeah.
And I think it's related to what you just said, but I want to bring it back to where I'm sitting, which is in Philadelphia, which has just come out of even before the election was coming out of protests and injustices of people with Black and brown skin and disproportionate ways that they're being treated. We seem to, in this country, be hiding some things, and we're not bringing them to light in the name of maybe economic development. I don't know, something else maybe. There's you already mentioned there's something at Congress, which will only move if certain people are in power. But do you think that this is the right moment? Is this the right solution for the place that I'm sitting or this country that I'm
in? It's very interesting. So I've actually written an article, the article about truth and reconciliation in the United States. In all my work on truth and reconciliation, the one country where I get the most opposition and skepticism is the United States. When I give talks in the United States and I work with my colleagues, and I used to teach in the United States. I used to teach at the University of North Carolina. And I've also worked at the law school at the University of Texas, the Rappaport Center for Human Rights. I find that my American colleagues are most skeptical of truth and reconciliation. And the interesting thing is that the skepticism is universal. It's not one group. I also hear a lot of skepticism from the Black colleagues and the African-American community. And I think it comes down to the very polarized political environment in the past few years. It's a very polarized society, as many will acknowledge. But there's also a sense, particularly in the African-American community, that it is not yet time for reconciliation. So the bill I told you is already making its way to Congress actually omits the reconciliation word. It's a bill for truth and justice. I have to find the language, but it deliberately omits reconciliation. And what I hear when I talk to both academics and policymakers is we can have both, at least not now in the United States. That in the United States, restorative justice will have to be at least a two-step process. A first commission just to get to the truth, because we can't agree on the truth. I gave the example of the Confederacy flag. It's amazing that there's still confusion about what exactly that means. And those are the kinds of problems that lend themselves very well to truth and reconciliation. So let's have an open conversation about this. Let's hear all the sides. Let's have a public hearing, a televised public hearing in school gymnasium. Let's know what the problem is, and let this whole process be coordinated at the national or state level in a way that we can have open and frank conversation about this. That would be the first step. And then they would argue that only when that process has played itself out can we begin to talk about a reconciliation. So I find that very interesting because I haven't had that, I haven't seen that done anywhere else. But that is what I hear, that there is a sense that the unique history and the unique politics of the United States might not be one that aligns neatly to the models that we've studied, and that the United States might require a more complicated process of restorative justice that attains to the unique history and politics of that country.
Yeah, I've got time, but just quickly, I've spent a lot of time in the community, right?
Yeah.
Like especially Kenya, but like in communities where you have long meetings and everybody talks and everybody gets an opportunity. Barazas, they call them in East Africa. And I so often think, wouldn't it be amazing? I mean, of course, there's local, like there's your PTA here, and there we have community groups. But the way that those meetings roll out and everybody gets a say and there's like an argument and everybody, but then everybody's laughing at the end of it. There's no parallel. And I've always felt like if we just did that, maybe there would be a bit more understanding amongst ourselves.
Yeah, hopefully that's what the Power of Truth Commission does, because now you have the sanction of this. The power of the state is ideally, an ideal Truth Commission should be people-driven, but with the resources and the power of the state behind it. So the people choose who will sit on the commission, the people choose where the hearings, the people decide on the agenda, but it has the legitimacy of the state. The state saying, we will listen to you and will support you in having this conversation. And also, I think it needs a little bit of directing, because Truth Commission processes can be polarized. And so, like in the case of South Africa, the deliberate appointment of an Anglican bishop in a country that is religious, the selective invocation of Ubuntu as a philosophy to undergird the process, the amnesty provision to encourage, the Afrikaner whites to participate. So it's a carefully choreographed process to get buy-in from everyone. It's not always perfect. But it's a process that hopefully gets enough buy-in to make the process legitimate.
Well, we will wait and see and hope for change.
Yes, we can only hope.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Having this conversation today. It's sort of it's restorative for me, I suppose. At the end of a long month. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.